They told her it was just a rash. That was the first and last time she ever let them tell her who she was. The air in the university clinic was sterile, thin, smelling of antiseptic wipes and unspoken anxieties. It was the kind of smell that promised healing but often delivered judgment. Amara sat on the edge of the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her, a sound too loud in the quiet room. Her hands, usually steady enough to paint constellations on a canvas the size of a thumbnail, were clasped tightly in her lap. She was a pre-med student. She understood biology, pathology, the delicate, often brutal poetry of the human body. She knew the butterfly taking shape on her face, spreading its faint, reddish wings across the bridge of her nose and onto her cheeks, was not just a rash. It felt like a warning. Dr. Jennings walked in without knocking. He was young, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from a life of correct answers and textbooks that looked just like him. He glanced at her chart, then at her face, his eyes lingering for a fraction of a second before a small, dismissive smile touched his lips. He didn't get closer than the foot of the table. "So we've got some eczema," he said, the words casual as if he were commenting on the weather. He made a note on his tablet, his back already turned halfway toward the door. Amara's voice, when she found it, was quiet but firm. "I don't think it's eczema, doctor. The pattern, the symmetry, it matches the photos for a malar rash." She had spent 3 sleepless nights with her face illuminated by the glow of her laptop, scrolling through medical journals, her own textbooks, and patient forums. She had seen this butterfly before. Jennings stopped his typing and turned to her, the smile now gone, replaced by a look of strained patience. It was a look she had seen before, in classrooms where her questions were deemed too aggressive, in labs where her insights were credited to the boy standing next to her. It was the look of a man who was not used to being corrected. "Miss," he glanced at the chart again, "Amara, you're a student here, I see, biology." He said the word biology like it was a quaint hobby, like she collected stamps. Let's not get ahead of ourselves with WebMD diagnoses. Eczema is incredibly common. Stress from exams can cause flare-ups. He offered the diagnosis like a pat on the head. "I'm pre-med," she clarified, the words tasting like metal in her mouth. "I've studied dermatology illustrations, and this—" He cut her off, his voice still smooth but with an edge of steel beneath it. "And those illustrations can be misleading. This is a classic presentation. I'll write you a prescription for a hydrocortisone cream. It'll clear up in a week or 2. Try to get some rest." He finished his note, tapped the screen, and placed the tablet on the counter. The appointment had lasted less than 4 minutes. She felt a cold wave of humiliation wash over her. He hadn't touched her skin. He hadn't used a dermatoscope. He hadn't asked about any other symptoms. He had looked at her, a young black woman, and seen a simple problem easily dismissed. He hadn't seen a scholar, a mind, a human being whose body was sending out a distress signal she was trying desperately to translate. Amara took a steadying breath. "Doctor, with all due respect, could you just look at the photo I have? It's from a peer-reviewed dermatological journal showing how lupus presents on darker skin." He finally looked her in the eye, and the professional mask slipped entirely. His expression was pure, undiluted condescension. "We don't treat patients based on photos they bring in from the internet. We treat them based on years of medical training." He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the handle. "Use the cream. Stop Googling your symptoms and focus on your studies. You'll find real medicine is a little more complex than search results." The door clicked shut, leaving Amara alone in the sterile silence. The butterfly on her face seemed to throb, a silent, mocking pulse. He hadn't just dismissed her concern. He had dismissed her intellect. He had dismissed her very reality. She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone. The rash wasn't just on her skin anymore. It was a brand, a mark of invisibility. And in that cold, quiet room, a different kind of fire began to burn within her. It wasn't the fire of a fever. It was the fire of a fight. The cream was thick and white, a lie in a tube. When Amara smoothed it over her skin that night, it didn't soothe. It burned. A low, insistent fire that felt like her own cells were rejecting the diagnosis, rejecting the condescension that came with it. She washed it off, her face raw and angrier than before. The butterfly's wings seemed to have darkened, a deeper shade of crimson against her brown skin. Days turned into a week, then two. The rash did not clear up. It settled in, a permanent resident on her face, a silent testament to Dr. Jennings' casual dismissal. But it wasn't just the rash anymore. A new symptom began to creep in, quiet at first, then louder. It started in her hands. The hands that could steady a scalpel in anatomy lab, that could paint nebulae with a brush of only a few bristles, began to ache. A deep, grinding pain in the joints of her fingers, like sand in the gears of a delicate machine. She was in the university library, her immunology textbook open, when the pain first became undeniable. She tried to turn a page, and a sharp, electric jolt shot from her knuckle to her wrist. She flinched, dropping the book. It hit the floor with a heavy thud that echoed the sudden, sinking weight in her chest. She stared at her hand, flexing her fingers. They felt swollen, foreign. Her grades, once a source of pride, began to slip. The fatigue came next. It was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of coffee or sleep could penetrate. It felt like walking through water, every movement requiring immense effort. She'd sit in lectures, the professor's voice a distant drone, her mind a fog. She, who had always been the first to raise her hand, now sat in the back, hoping not to be called on, her notebook empty. The words swam before her eyes. She went back to the clinic. Dr. Jennings was busy, so she was seen by another physician, a woman named Dr. Albright, who glanced at the notes from the first visit. "Oh, the eczema is being stubborn," she said, her tone sympathetic but still rooted in the initial mistake. "Dr. Jennings is very thorough. Sometimes these things just need a stronger dose." She didn't ask about new symptoms. She didn't re-examine the rash. She simply doubled the prescription for the same useless cream. "Give it another few weeks," she'd said, smiling, "and try not to stress." Amara left the clinic that day feeling a despair so heavy it was physical. The system wasn't just failing her. It was actively working against her, reinforcing its own error, building a wall of denial around her truth. She felt like she was screaming in a soundproof room. That night, she called her mother. Denise's voice, warm and familiar, traveled through the phone from over 1,000 miles away. Amara tried to keep her own voice steady, but it broke as she described the spreading rash, the aching joints, the fog in her brain. "They're not listening to me, Mama. They look at me and they see a girl who's being dramatic. They don't see what's really happening." Her mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, her voice fierce with a love that felt like armor, "Baby, you come from a line of women who were told they were nothing and still built kingdoms. You listen to your body, it knows the truth, and you make them listen, you hear me. You don't let them turn you into a ghost." After the call, something shifted in Amara. The despair began to curdle into resolve. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "You make them listen." She wasn't a ghost. She was a scientist. And if they wouldn't listen to her words, she would make them listen to data. She pulled out a new notebook. At the top of the first page, she wrote, "Case Study, Amara Kai Johnson." She began to document everything. She took high-resolution photos of the rash every morning, tracking its subtle changes in color and texture. She created a log for her symptoms, rating her joint pain and fatigue on a scale of 1 to 10. She noted the time of day, what she'd eaten, the weather. She documented every condescending phrase from a doctor, every dismissive nurse, every unanswered question. Her hands ached as she wrote, but she pushed through the pain. The notebook became her weapon. The meticulous logging, the careful gathering of evidence, was no longer just a pre-med student's habit. It was an act of rebellion. It was the first small victory in a war they didn't even know she was fighting. She was building a case, her own case, and she would be the lead investigator, the key witness, and the final, undeniable proof. The name came like a whisper, passed through the quiet, resilient network that Black folks have always relied on when the official channels fail them. Her mother had called her aunt, who called a church sister, who knew a woman whose cousin had been through something similar years ago. The name was Dr. Elias Vance. He was a dermatologist, but more than that, he was a legend. One of the old guard, a man who had trained at Howard when most medical schools were still hostile territories. He was semi-retired now, only seeing patients a few days a week at a small, independent clinic in a part of the city the university doctors likely never visited. Getting an appointment felt like trying to penetrate a fortress. The first time Amara called, the receptionist, a woman with a voice as weary as it was firm, cut her off. "Dr. Vance isn't accepting new patients. You'll have to go through the university hospital system." "I've been through that system," Amara said, her voice tight with a frustration she was struggling to contain. "They're not helping me. Please, I was told he might be able to. He's semi-retired, dear. His schedule is full for the next 6 months." The line went dead. Amara stared at her phone, the dial tone a shrill, mocking sound. But the fire her mother had stoked in her was not so easily extinguished. She called back the next day and the day after that. She sent an email, a carefully worded plea attaching a single, clear photo of the butterfly rash on her face. She didn't mention her pre-med studies or her research. She just described her symptoms, the pain, the exhaustion, the feeling of being unheard. She wrote from the heart, not the head. A week passed with no reply. Her symptoms were worsening. The joint pain now lived in her knees and shoulders, a constant, dull fire. Some mornings, it was a struggle just to get out of bed. She'd look in the mirror and see a stranger. The light in her eyes, the one that had always burned with curiosity and ambition, was dimming. She was losing weight. Her hair was starting to thin. The butterfly on her face felt less like a mark and more like a mask, one she couldn't take off. Just as she was beginning to lose hope, her phone buzzed. An unknown number, she answered, her heart hammering. "Is this Amara Johnson?" The voice was the same weary receptionist from the clinic. "Yes, this is she." There was a pause. "Dr. Vance saw your email. He had a cancellation. He can see you tomorrow morning at 9. Don't be late." Relief washed over Amara so intensely her knees went weak. She sank onto her bed, clutching the phone. It wasn't just an appointment. It was a lifeline. The next morning, she walked into Dr. Vance's clinic. It was nothing like the sterile, impersonal university hospital. The waiting room was small and warm, with worn wooden chairs and framed prints of black artists on the walls. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. When her name was called, she was led into an examination room that looked more like a professor's study. Bookshelves overflowed with medical texts, their spines cracked and annotated. Dr. Elias Vance rose from behind his desk to greet her. He was a tall, slender man in his late 70s, with skin the color of rich soil and eyes that held the quiet, profound wisdom of a man who had seen it all. He didn't look at a chart, he looked at her. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice a low, gentle baritone. "Thank you for being so persistent," he gestured to the chair. "Now tell me everything, start from the beginning." And she did. For the next 20 minutes, Amara talked and he listened. He truly listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't type on a tablet, didn't glance at the clock. His focus was entirely on her. She told him about the rash, the joint pain, the crushing fatigue, the hair loss. She told him about Dr. Jennings, about the burning cream, about being told it was just stress. When she was finished, she pulled out her notebook, the case study of her own body. "I brought my logs," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "And photos." He took the notebook from her, his long, elegant fingers turning the pages with care. He studied the photos, the symptom logs, her meticulous notes. He nodded slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes. "You did their job for them," he said softly. Then he stood up and came toward her. He didn't stop a foot away. He came right up to the examination table and gently, respectfully, tilted her chin up to the light. He looked at the butterfly rash, his gaze intense and focused. He didn't need a dermatoscope. He didn't need a textbook. He had seen this butterfly countless times over 50 years of practice. He had seen it on faces like hers, faces that the textbooks so often forgot. He lightly touched the skin on her cheek, his touch clinical yet kind. He examined her hands, gently pressing on the swollen joints of her fingers. He asked about sensitivity to sunlight, about mouth sores, about her breathing. Finally, he stepped back, his expression somber but certain. He looked her directly in the eye, and the words he spoke were the most validating, the most terrifying, and the most freeing she had ever heard. "Amara," he said, and the way he said her name made her feel seen for the first time in months. "This is not eczema. This is not stress. You have a classic malar rash, photosensitivity, and polyarthritis. This is systemic lupus erythematosus." Lupus. The word she had typed into search bars in the dead of night, the word she had whispered to herself, the word Dr. Jennings had laughed away. The diagnosis landed in the quiet room, and with it, the walls of denial Amara had been beating against finally came crashing down. She didn't feel fear. She didn't feel anger. All she felt was a profound, overwhelming wave of relief. She covered her face with her hands, and for the first time in a very long time, she cried. They were not tears of sadness or pain. They were tears of validation, a quiet, heartbroken, and triumphant flood of being believed. Dr. Vance didn't rush her. He simply stood by, a silent, steady presence, letting her release the months of frustration, fear, and invisibility. When her sobs finally subsided, he handed her a tissue and a glass of water. "Now," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "the fight begins. But you're not fighting alone anymore." He walked back to his desk and pulled out a prescription pad, but he also pulled out a business card. On it, he wrote down the name and number of the best rheumatologist in the state. "She's a friend. I'll call her myself. You'll have an appointment this week." Then he looked at her, his eyes serious. What those doctors did at the university clinic, it wasn't just poor medicine. It was a failure of the most fundamental kind, and it cannot go unanswered. He tapped her notebook, which still lay open on his desk. This right here, this is your power. You have documented your own neglect. The question is, what do you want to do with it? Amara looked at him. The tears dried on her cheeks, the fire back in her eyes. The pre-med student who had walked into that clinic months ago was gone. In her place sat a warrior. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else," she said, her voice steady and clear. Dr. Vance nodded slowly, a faint, proud smile touching his lips. "I thought you might say that. I believe the hospital has a board review meeting every quarter. The next one is in 3 weeks. I think it's time we taught them a lesson in a subject they seem to have forgotten, listening to their patients." The atmosphere in the hospital boardroom was as cold and polished as the long mahogany table that dominated its center. It was a room designed for power, for quiet decisions that affected thousands of lives, made by a handful of people in expensive suits. Amara sat at one end of the table, flanked by Dr. Vance. She wore a simple, professional dress, her hands resting on top of her closed notebook. The butterfly rash on her face was still visible, a faint, proud scar of her journey. Across from them sat the hospital administrators, their faces impassive. And next to them, looking uncomfortable and trying to project an air of detached confidence, was Dr. Jennings. He refused to make eye contact with Amara. The meeting began with the usual formalities, a dry recitation of budgets and quarterly reports. Then the chairman, a stern-looking man named Mr. Harrison, turned to Dr. Vance. "Dr. Vance, the floor is yours. You requested this time to discuss a patient care issue." Dr. Vance stood, his tall frame commanding the room's attention. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. I'm not here today to discuss an issue. I'm here to discuss a systemic failure. A failure of observation, a failure of curiosity, and a failure of respect. It's a failure embodied in the case of Miss Amara Johnson." He gestured to Amara. As he spoke, a presentation appeared on the large screen behind him. It started with the first photo Amara had taken of her rash. "Miss Johnson, a pre-med student at your own university, presented to your clinic with this rash. She was diagnosed with eczema and stress. She was prescribed a steroidal cream that, predictably, exacerbated her condition." He clicked to the next slide, a side-by-side image. On the left, a page from the standard dermatology textbook used by the university. It showed a photo of eczema on pale, white skin. On the right, a page from an article in the New England Journal of Medicine showing a classic malar rash on a black woman's face. The resemblance to Amara's rash was undeniable. "The problem," Dr. Vance continued, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "is that the tools we use to teach are often as biased as the people who use them. Our textbooks have, for decades, overwhelmingly featured dermatological conditions on white skin. This creates a dangerous blind spot. A physician who relies solely on this limited visual library will fail their patients of color. Every single time." Dr. Jennings shifted in his seat, his face flushing. He cleared his throat. "With all due respect, a diagnosis is more complex than just a photograph." "Is it?" Dr. Vance interrupted, turning his gaze on him. The air crackled with tension. "Is it more complex than asking about other symptoms? Miss Johnson was experiencing severe joint pain, fatigue, and hair loss. Were you aware of this, Dr. Jennings?" Jennings hesitated, She didn't mention, because you didn't ask. The words were not shouted, but they hit like a thunderclap. You saw a young black woman, you saw a simple rash, and you stopped looking. You stopped thinking. You stopped listening. Dr. Vance paused, letting the weight of his accusation settle in the silent room. Then he looked to Amara. Miss Johnson would like to speak for herself. Amara stood. All eyes were on her. She felt a tremor in her hands, but her voice was as solid as stone. She didn't speak as a victim. She spoke as a colleague, a future physician. Dr. Jennings, she began, looking directly at him for the first time. He met her gaze, his own eyes wide with a dawning horror. You told me that real medicine was more complex than search results. You're right. It is. It's the differential diagnosis you failed to perform. It's the immunological cascade you failed to consider. It's the patient history you failed to take. She opened her notebook. On October 14th, when I told you the rash felt hot and wasn't responding to the cream, you told me to be patient. On November 2nd, when I came back with documented polyarticular pain, your clinic doubled the dose of the wrong medication. You didn't just misdiagnose me. You dismissed me. You made my own body a hostile territory and then blamed me for getting lost in it. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the board members. The most dangerous disease in this hospital isn't lupus. It's the assumption that people who look like me are exaggerating, that we are unreliable narrators of our own pain. You are training a generation of doctors to see skin but not the person in it. Dr. Jennings finally broke. He looked down at the polished table, his confidence shattered, replaced by the stark, public shame of his own ignorance. He was speechless. Amara took a deep breath. I'm going to be a doctor one day, and I promise you I will never, ever make a patient feel as invisible as your staff made me feel. That is my oath. She sat down. The silence in the room was absolute, profound. It was the sound of a system being forced to look at its own reflection. The revenge wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, intellectual, and devastating. It wasn't about destroying one man's career. It was about dismantling the arrogance that had allowed him to flourish. It was poetic justice, served cold and irrefutable, in the very room where power had, for so long, been blind. The hospital didn't have a choice. The board review sent shockwaves through the institution. Faced with the undeniable evidence of Amara's meticulous logs and Dr. Vance's towering reputation, they moved swiftly to contain the fallout. Dr. Jennings was placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. But Amara knew that punishing one doctor was like pulling a single weed from an overgrown field. The real victory had to be systemic. At Dr. Vance's insistence, and with the threat of a lawsuit hanging in the air, the hospital board agreed to implement a new, mandatory training program for all clinical staff. It was to be called the Vance-Johnson Initiative for Diagnostic Equity. Its focus was singular: to deconstruct racial bias in medical diagnosis, starting with dermatology. Dr. Vance was asked to lead it, and he agreed on one condition. He called Amara a week later. They want me to design the curriculum, he told her. And I told them I would, but only if you would serve as a paid student consultant. They need to hear from you, from the person they failed. Amara accepted without hesitation. For the rest of the academic year, she worked alongside Dr. Vance. She helped select new textbooks that featured a wide range of skin tones. She co-wrote case studies based on her own experience. She stood before rooms of medical students, residents, and attending physicians, her peers and her superiors, and told her story. She was no longer just a patient. She was a teacher. Her own health, under the care of the rheumatologist Dr. Vance had recommended, began to stabilize. The new medications worked. The fatigue lessened, the joint pain receded into a manageable ache. The butterfly on her face faded, leaving behind only the faintest trace, a ghostly reminder of the battle she had won. Her grades soared. The light returned to her eyes. Years passed. Amara graduated from her pre-med program with honors, then from medical school at the top of her class. She specialized in rheumatology, driven by a passion forged in the fire of her own illness. The final scene of her long journey did not take place in a hospital or a clinic. It took place in a quiet university bookstore. Dr. Amara Johnson, now a respected physician and a fierce patient advocate, stood before a shelf of medical textbooks. She pulled one from the shelf. It was the latest edition of a famous dermatology atlas, the same one Dr. Jennings had failed to learn from. She opened it to the chapter on autoimmune diseases. There, under the section for lupus, was a series of photographs illustrating the malar rash on a spectrum of skin tones. A fair-skinned woman with a bright red blush. An East Asian woman with a subtle violet hue across her cheeks. A Latina woman with a deeper brownish-red pattern. And then, the last photo. A young black woman, her face framed by short twists, looking directly at the camera with clear, intelligent eyes. Across the bridge of her nose and cheeks was the unmistakable, perfectly symmetrical shape of a butterfly. Amara traced the image with her finger, a small, knowing smile on her lips. She had not only survived, she had rewritten the very text that had been used against her. She had turned her pain into a lesson, her invisibility into a beacon. Some victories are won in courtrooms. Others are won in the quiet, resolute act of changing the world so that no one else has to fight the same war. Some textbooks are written in ink. Hers was written in scars.